everyone. Welcome to the episode of Compensation Insider. This episode is largely focused around DEIB, and joining us today is Dr. Laura, who is a seasoned advisor, coach, trainer who has propelled DEI efforts across various sectors. Laura, we are truly honored to have you here.
Juan, thank you so much for having me and just want to say hello to our audience members. While I introduce myself, I just also want people to have an open mind about what diversity, equity, inclusion, and I put all of that under the umbrella of belonging. And so I am a professor of social work at a university in the United States in New Jersey, and I teach around social work, right? So I teach social workers how to work with communities. In addition to that, I also have a consulting practice where I work with for-profits, nonprofits, law firms around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And so basically what that means is that I work with companies and CEOs and executives, and I help teams build places and spaces of belonging. So I'm really looking at organizational culture and how when you hire for diversity, that diversity is included in those efforts, right? And that we also are looking at equity, which I define as sharing of power. So these are really important principles. I got into the work because my own background is that I identify as Latina, a Black Latina who's also Jewish. And so my dad was from Puerto Rico and Venezuela, and my mom from Eastern Europe. And I grew up in spaces that weren't inclusive, right? So I grew up in spaces of racism and anti-Semitism. And so I really wanted to create spaces within my home, within my community, within organizations where people feel that they belong. I think this is incredibly important as our workforce starts to get more diverse. And when people feel they belong, they work better, they work harder. And so that's a little bit about me and my work. And so I'm excited to talk more with you about like unpacking this language, because I think people have a lot of preconceived notions around what diversity, equity, inclusion is. And sometimes it's not true. So let's get into it.
Absolutely, absolutely, Dr. Laura. In fact, let's get started directly with, I would say, decompressing what DEIB is all about. Initially, I'm not sure you're the best to discuss, but initially it was just DEI, right? With the addition of B, what is that? And how is this exactly changing? If, in India landscape, this is still to catch up, but it has been quite prominent in the West. So if you can talk a little more about this journey of this domain, and how is this evolving, how is this looked upon, and the companies that have successfully implemented this, what are the positive changes that they've seen in productivity, culture, or otherwise, if you can shed some light on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first we have to think about just the word diversity, right? And what diversity means is difference. And difference within cultures too. Like, much more than I do that the Indian culture is very diverse, right? Southern India, Northern India, religion. There's so much diversity in that. And so the first thing is to really think about what we mean by diversity. The second piece is inclusion. And so inclusion is about when people and companies hire for diversity, when they bring on talent that doesn't look like the talent that is already there, they have to change their organizational culture to make sure those people are actually included. Because if not, they'll leave, right? Like, people need to be able to feel like they are included in communications, in meetings, in performance reviews, in hiring, in promotion. And then the third principle is equity, which in my work seems to be the hardest for people, because I've seen in US companies, they'll say, oh, we're hiring for diversity, or we're going to create inclusive spaces. But when people are asked to share power, which is the definition of equity, that's when they shy away. When people say, you know what, let's look at the salary distribution here. If we're really looking at equity, then the people at the top have to make more money so that the people in the middle management, and people at the bottom can have more, right? So they can have more resources. And that's the piece where people start to shy away and say, oh, I don't want to share my power. I don't want to share, I don't want to look at the budget from the lens of equity. I don't want to give my seat up at the table. I don't want to share, that board appointment with somebody else. And so when we look at those three principles, I put them under the umbrella of belonging. I don't want in my work, I don't think of belonging as something separate. I think about DEI under this umbrella of belonging. So the goal when I work with organizations is that how do you create a culture of belonging? How do you look at who you have? And it has to start from the top, right? It has to start with the board of directors, and then it has to start with the executive team and the executive staff. Because if it doesn't start there, then it's not really sincere. It's more what we call performative, right? So a lot of the success I've had is when I work with organizations and I start with the board and I start with leaders and I say, okay, when we hear diversity, equity, inclusion, what does that mean to you? What does that, and sometimes people have a political affiliation with it. Sometimes people think that it's something that they have to be forced into. And it's actually not. It's just about how do we look at what we have here as an organization and create opportunities where people feel that they belong, where people have leadership roles. So again, I think I start with the board. I work with the executive. Another successful way to integrate DEI is individual coaching, because I think part of this work is about vulnerability for leaders. I think in the West, we see a lot of white male identified leaders who've never done this work before, right? And so how do you sit in a space of not knowing when you're supposed to know everything as a leader? And so I work very carefully and from the place of empathy and love with a lot of my executives, because it's a hard learning for them, right, to share power, to be inclusive. That's not what traditional leadership tells especially men to do. And so a lot of my success has been, again, working with the board, working with executives, getting people in individual coaching sessions, and just being available for everyday challenges that come up.
Got it. Got it. Laura, if you can talk about one such engagement that you otherwise do with companies, can you talk to us? What does a typical engagement look like? As in, you touched upon bits and pieces that you start with the board, you talk to the founders, you talk to the execs, but can you tell us, is this more like an ad hoc thing wherein you would engage with the company once throughout their lifetime, do it for 3 months, or is it more of seasonal where you would do this every year, or is it more of an ongoing effort that you engage with companies? So, if you can talk to us about a typical engagement that fetches the best results that you otherwise do.
Sure. I think that's a really good question, because I think what happens sometimes is people hire consultants to come in and just do a training. So they'll say, okay, we need a training on implicit bias, for example. But then when the consultant leaves, so does the learning. Companies are really busy. And so sitting in a training for 2 hours is not going to change organizational culture. You might learn something new. You might, think more deeply about something, but the next day when you are under, under the gun or under siege with so much to do, you're going to forget about that learning because it's not integrated. And so what doesn't work, I'll start with what doesn't work, is one shot trainings, right? So while it's great to bring in a consultant to do a training, you have to follow up and hold people accountable. I think part of what makes this work successful is the accountability piece. And when I say accountability, I mean from the most empathetic, loving way, that you're not shaming people, but you're actually asking them, okay, how are you implementing this? When did implicit bias show up for you? What's your challenge in working with somebody who looks different than you, right? Or working with somebody who speaks different than you, right? Are you judging them because of a quote unquote accent? Are you judging them because of what they might bring for lunch, or who they talk to, right? And so what does work is longer engagements, right? So some of the organizations that I'm working with now, I've been working with for over 2 years, right? And what that looks like is I do some coaching with them. I meet with their executive team. I work with their committees. A lot of organizations, I help them build diversity, equity, inclusion committees, which is also a nice place for people to have informal leadership. And so I'll work with the leads of that committee. I've worked with employee resource groups. And so my engagement is I'll like, have a retainer with an organization for every month, and then they can use me as they want, right, to really implement this work. I also provide support to the DEI expert or the DEI lead. Some companies hire a chief diversity officer, but that is not on that person can't hold all of this work. Like I think the issue with the officer is that people are like, oh, we have a DEI officer, so we don't need to do anything. And that's actually not true. Everybody needs to be involved in this. And so I help communicate DEI efforts. I support the DEI chief operating officer. I run trainings. So the engagement is it's ongoing in some instances. And then I think what starts to happen is after 3 years or so, it's more implemented in the organization, and I can fall back a little bit. But I'm always there for a question or a comment, because it's about relationship building, right? That's what shifts organizational culture, is the relationship building.
Got it, got it. Since you mentioned that it has to be an ongoing effort, plus an organization which has not done anything in this domain, in this, they have not even hired a DEI lead, for example, right? Do you think a one-off engagement that would last, say, for about 3 months, get a DEI lead hired within the company? Have you seen those engagement work anytime, or do you think that is something that will never work?
So I don't like to use never, because you never know, right? Like I don't like to yeah. So I mean, I think it can work once people start getting going. And I'll also say that people need to be open to the challenges that they're confronted with in that process, right? So if you hire me to come in for 3 months and do a training and work with that chief diversity officer and get things going, and then you end the engagement, but then something comes up 3 months later, are you able to pick up the phone and say, hey, Laura, or whoever you're working with, could you come in for another month or so? We need some tweaking. We need some, organization. Or it might not be me, it might be somebody else, right? But as long as a company stays open to the challenges, because it's everyday challenges that come up, and that they also do self-reflective work, because I think that's the other thing. Sometimes I've learned sometimes that people ask for a handout. They'll be like, oh, tell me how to be more diverse, equitable, inclusive. Like, here, give me the handout. Tell me what to read. Tell me what movie to watch. That's not how it works, right? Like, I can't give you, if I could give you a handout, I would, but I can't. And I probably wouldn't anyway, because so much of
Correct.
this work is about the personal self-reflection on
Correct.
where we all have implicit bias. The research says 99.9 of us have implicit bias. So if you're not going to be honest to that with yourself first, you're not going to be able to shift organizational culture for others.
Got it, got it. Laura, can you talk about these efforts? Where do they stem from? As in, an organization who has done nothing so far, all of a sudden thinks that they want to do this. What are they driven by? Is it compliance, or is it something else that they are driven by? They actually see a lack of motivation among certain section of people. Is that the reason why they start this?
I mean, I think it's different reasons for different people. I think it's critical incidents in our environment, right? We see the murder of George Floyd in the United States and the impact that had. All of a sudden, companies now wanted to do work because they realized that there was such a thing as police brutality and racism, and so that was a motivating force. Definitely critical incidents. I think compliance for sure. And then I also think there are some leaders who just really want to change organizational culture, and it's driven by their heart. And so that's a beautiful thing, because that's when it really, really works, and it really, really sticks.
Got it. Got it. Also, Laura, you talked about hurdles that a company would face while they're trying to implement this in their organizations. Right? Can you talk a little more on what those hurdles are typically, and how should one go about overcoming them, or maybe a typical engagement of yours where you've come across these hurdles, and how did you eventually go ahead and resolve them?
Yeah, I think one hurdle is personal hurdles. Like, I think people have bias, and they are, unwilling or unable to move past that. So I think their own personal reflections stop them, or their own personal life experience, their values that they grew up with just don't allow for this kind of work.
Correct.
I think definitely people are challenged by how fast the work moves, in law firms, in corporations, it's you have to move fast, and you have to get things done quickly. And so sometimes that doesn't allow for the intentional integration of inclusivity, right? Because you just have to move so fast and get the work done that you're not thinking about who you're including, you're not thinking about your language that you're using. And so that the fast pacedness of the business world sometimes is a challenge. I think competition, right? Like I think people are weighed down by survival of the fittest, and I want to get the prize, and I really don't want to share that space with anyone else. And then I think people are also challenged by just ideology in the West, right? I think it's really hard to do this work because it takes so much unlearning as it does learning. And so those are some of the challenges that I think people are faced with.
Got it. And in the current, I would say, macroeconomic condition where a lot of these initiatives have taken a backseat,
Yeah.
for want of whatever the priorities may be, where do you see this heading? Do you think this has taken a hit, or do you think this is temporary, or do you think this was anyway vanity for a lot of organization and hence it has taken a hit? Where do you see the reason?
I mean, I think that's a good question that we have to keep asking ourselves. I think that one, it has taken a hit because I think people don't understand what it is. Like, I think there's been a
Right.
lot of rhetoric and politics involved in the work of diversity, equity, inclusion. And if people would just sit down and say, okay, first tell me what this means to you, because if we could dispel some of those myths, like, because it's really just about belonging. Like, how do you create a culture of belonging? So I think that that's what I always want to do is like, tell me when you hear these words, like, what does it mean for you and what comes up for you? So I think it's definitely taken a hit, which is a shame. I think, but I have to live in the space of love and possibility, right? Like I really feel like this work is not just what I do, but it's how I live. And so I think that as long as there are people that do this work from the heart space and are really trying to change not only organizational culture, but the world, really, like, I know that sounds a little trite, but it's true, right? There's so much beauty in diversity and inclusion and in equity, that how do we kind of shift our ideology and our ways of being to be kinder people to ourselves and to each other, to really create a world where we can learn from each other. So I think, coming back to your question, yes, it's taken a hit. I don't know where it's going, but I know I'm not going to stop doing the work that I'm doing. And so I encourage other people to lean into this discomfort that this may come up for you, and explore really what this means to you, and really work hard to create those organizational cultures of belonging where people that look different, act different, have gone to different schools, really have the opportunity to show up in spaces of leadership.
Right, right. And also, companies across different sizes would have engaged with you to implement these efforts. But I'm assuming, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm assuming that there would be a certain maturity or readiness even before they start engaging with you, right? Do you think there is some degree, or some degree of scale, as in a certain number of employee strength, or a certain degree of maturity that the companies need to have before they engage with you? Or do you think you've worked across companies which are as low as X and as high as whatever number?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that a company, I mean, I've worked with startups and I've worked with companies that have been around for hundreds of years, like, or, yeah. So I think it's actually beautiful to work with a startup because you're just starting, right? And
Right.
so you can infuse these values into the organizational structure. Whereas when you're working with companies who have been around for a long time, you're also dealing with organizational history. So you're also dealing with things that may have happened in the past that people are still holding on to, or ways in which there wasn't communication or transparency, or there was some sort of hurt, and so people are still holding on to that. So I don't think a company, I think, like, again, I've worked with startups from like day one to companies that have been around for a very long time, and so I think it's just about how open you are to the engagement, and not a level of maturity.
Got it, got it. And there are a lot of we spoke about this in the initial part of our conversation, but there are a lot of misconceptions about what will this engagement get me, as in what should I expect to implement, what should, or maybe let us keep it simple, what are the common misconceptions that founders come up to you with, as in when they think or plan to engage with you, what are some of the common misconceptions that they tell you, hey, I want to do this, and then you actually educate them that, what, if you're thinking this is wrong, this is what our engagement would mean, and this is what you could see. Can you talk about some common misconceptions that the founders
Sure.
would?
Yeah, I think common misperceptions are that it's gonna be a quick fix, right? That I'm gonna come in, I'm gonna do a training, and everyone's gonna be good to go. So that's one, like the quick fix is a misconception. I think the other piece is this. I think this work is successful when I'm able to go in and be organic and work with what's in front of me. And I think some founders want a template. Okay, well, what are you going to say and what are you going to do and what's going to be the action step? And although there are things that definitely are action steps every time I engage, I can't predict what a human is going to walk away with. I can't, if I don't know where people are on this journey, I have no idea what they're going to hold on to, what they're going to implement, what they're going to change, or what they're not going to change. So I think sometimes founders are nervous about the lack of detail and clarity with which I am going into an engagement with, and are unable to just say, okay, like, this is going to be a little bit of unknown, but I'm going to trust the process and I'm going to move along. And I always say, if we do something the first time and it doesn't feel right for you or something happened, like, we don't have to engage again. That's totally fine. Right. So
Correct.
I think that, leaders want to know what the end result is before it even happens. And,
You're right. You're right.
we can't predict that. So that's a big misconception. And then the other thing, I think, people talk about hiring for diversity and they want that to happen really fast. But some of these pipelines aren't diverse, right? Like, you look
Correct.
at law firm culture, for example, you look at corporate culture, right? There's not many people of color in that pipeline, right? And in the West, at least, these predominantly white institutions are producing not diverse leaders, right? And so there's not a lot of diverse talent. And when there is, it's highly competitive, right?
Correct.
So, yeah, yeah.
So a very interesting thing there, Laura. If you're saying that there's not enough talent available across different functions, families, sub families, there may not be actually many people available for hiring. How do you then build an environment which is diverse? That is one. The second
Yeah.
part of my question is, as a platform, we've come across scenarios where we give out biased results, as in a merit increment has happened, and we are able to then tell them that, hey, you know what, on an average, this function has gone above the suggested value of increment for males and below the suggested value of increment for females, or above the suggested value of increment for a certain ethnicity and below the suggested value of increment for all other ethnicities, right? These scenarios are real, right?
Hmm.
Of course, you would coach the execs, the managers who are responsible for appraisal decisions or financial decisions to not have this bias. But if there is no talent available, or I would say if the talent is subpar, right? How do you then account for, or how do you then catch these biases, as in, is there a system in place, are there firms in place in the US? In India there are not a lot, but in the US, are there firms in place who would do these audits and identify these biases, or do you think this is more of an internal thing to do, and this is something that will anyway be there and you cannot coach managers beyond a certain point?
No, I mean, I don't know if there's a programming to do that here. There very well might be. I do think, however, the first step is working with what you have. So even if there's not diverse talent, how are you training? How are you working with, for example, the white leaders to understand how they can also be more inclusive and how they can lean into what we might call allyship, right? And so I think sometimes people are like, oh, we don't have diverse talent, So it's a wash, but it's not a wash because if you have, five white males in front of you in position of leaderships, you can still do the work, right? This work is not just for the diverse town. This work is also for white leaders, right? To understand what their bias is, how they can be in spaces of allyship, how they can be mentors to other people who might be in lower positions than them, how they can seek out diverse talent on their own, right? So I do think people change, and I do think people have can come to an awareness of their biases. Absolutely, but I think it's often, we go back to that question about challenges or misconceptions that you can't do diversity work in a non-diverse space, and that's not true, right? Like there's so much there. It's not only race, it's not only culture, it's ability, right? It's gender, it's religion. All of these are ways in which to increase the diversity of an organization, and when you don't have diverse talent, you work with what you have.
Got it. Got it. Laura, if you can also guide our audience somewhat, you've already negated that before, but are there any resources? Are there any, I would say, reading material, or a lecture series or a podcast or any courses that I would say growth stage startups or people organizations who are embarking on this journey of DI for the first time can garner more knowledge, more insights into? If there are some resources that you can share, also if there are any interesting reads that you can suggest to the audience.
Yeah, I don't have my list with me, but I think if people, I think that do I have it here? Yeah, there's a book called Biased, and yeah, it's by Jennifer Ebenhart, and it just talks about, some people don't believe that implicit bias is true, but this is scientific, and it has a lot. Those of you that like, quantitative data, it's in here to look at. I also have a website and a book on my website that has a lot of different articles and work that I've done that people can take a look at. I don't know. Do you want me to share my website, or you can?
Yes,
Um,
if you can just provide information on how individuals and organizations interested in your expertise can reach out to you for guidance, for support, or a professional engagement. If you can share some details with respect to that.
Yeah, so my website is Laura, LauraQC.com. So it's LauraQC.com. And that has a lot of information, has contact information on it. I also think there's a lot of good articles and books out there too that people could do a Google search on. I also just want to caution people that while there's reading and there's resources, like, what are you doing with that? Like, I think other times people like to engage in intellectualism. Like, they like to talk about the book or they like to talk about the read, but they're not focusing. I call it speaking from the eye. They're not saying, okay, for me, or this, this brought up this point, or I'm challenged by this, right? They're always kind of looking externally. And so I think that resources are wonderful. And then how are you talking about them? How are you using them? How are you self-reflecting on them? Not that you're just watching them to absorb the data, and then keep it moving. So that's, I am obviously I'm an academic. I read all the time, but I'm also careful about resources because I think sometimes people move to the space of externalization and intellectualization rather than sitting with the self.
Very true. Very true. Thank you so much, Laura, for the profound insights that you shared on the significance of the IB and how exactly to go about it. I'm sure this will bring about a lot of change in the mindset of our audience, and definitely, I would request all the people to do reach out to Laura, read about what she's written in the past, reach out to her website, and see if Laura can be of help. She can be reached at the email ID that you can find on the website. Thank you so much once again, Laura, for